Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday seminar with the Security Studies Program. I'm Taylor Fravel, as most of you know, the director of the Security Studies Program, but I feel like I should say this for everyone watching on Zoomland. I'm really delighted today to welcome James or Jimmy Goodrich. He's a consultant and advisor at the RAND Corporation and also a senior fellow with the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, as he reminds me, in sunny San Diego. Um, he is
the sunnier version of your
the sunnier. Yes, he is probably the country's leading expert on technology, geopolitics, and national security, with a focus on China and East Asia. So we're really lucky to have him with us today. Previously, he was a vice president for global policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association, where he led the industry's supply chain, international trade, export control, global market research, and China efforts. I won't go on to all of his other sort of past affiliations, but I do want to note that he's a proud graduate of Lexington High School, and so it's really nice to have you back in the area, and we can't wait to hear what you have to share with us today. Welcome, Jimmy.
I was just back and hearing that there's a $800 million high school renovation going on. So it'll be the most expensive high school in the country, public high school. So as a young child, I grew up in the area, so it's good to be back. And thank you, Taylor, for the invitation to come and talk about some of the research that I've been doing with RAND and with UC IGCC. So over the past 2 years, I've been focused on leveraging open source research and analysis to understand, map out, and assess different areas of China's technology capabilities in deep and emerging tech. My background originally is in telecoms and microelectronics. Before SIA, the Semiconductor Industry Association, I lived and worked in China for about a decade. I worked for Cisco Systems, a nonprofit studying Chinese technology ecosystem. And that was about 7 years total. And then director of China policy at another trade association for high-tech companies like Google, Meta, Intel, and others. So my whole career has really been focused at the nexus of technology, policy, and U.S.-China relations. And I benefited from spending some time in country in China, and then also more recently over the last decade in DC, watching how everything from export controls to trade policy has impacted a lot of these global supply chain and technology issues. Throughout, though, the course of my research, one area that I've been trying to spend more increasing time on is China's own domestic policy ecosystem for science and technology. If you look back and kind of trace the history of science in the United States and our soft power, hard power, whether it's economic, technological, or military, a lot of that comes from the huge investments that the U.S. has made over the several decades, I have to repeat this to MIT, in our national science ecosystem and enterprise. And China is sort of, through the research that I've been doing and visits I've been going back and forth to China, talking to their own universities and labs, talking to the scientific community here in the United States, is obviously been investing over the last several decades in its own science, technology, education ecosystem. But more recently, I believe it's at an inflection point, increasing significantly and recreating much of what the United States has built over several decades, which is a national science enterprise with big science at the center. Big science being large national labs, large scientific devices, and infrastructure that will help China advance our scientific understanding in many different domains, contribute to global science, but also contribute to China's own national development priorities. So today's talk is going to go into this this area, which I believe is relatively undercovered. If you meet a lot of China analysts, basic science is not a popular domain of China to study. In fact, I don't think there's really anyone full-time that is studying China's basic science policy ecosystem. There's a small little think tank in Germany at Max Planck Institute as 2 people studying the history of science in China. Merix in Germany is doing some work funded by the German government as well to look into this area, but there is no real dedicated effort or program in the United States outside of the Department of Energy and some of their national lab analysts. But that work you never see because it's behind a wall. So I've been looking at why China is moving into this inflection point, when and how have we perceived this shift in funding and policy priorities? What are the areas in which China is investing in? And how that may benefit different scientific or technological advancements, whether it's in microelectronics or in space or other areas. Really fundamentally, basic science investments will help propel those innovations. And so that'll be the overall framework of the talk I'm going to give today. I've got about 20 or so slides that I'll go through, and then happy to engage in a good Q&A. I've been told from Taylor, your audience is very well prepared, loves asking great questions, like to be challenged. Thinking about the era of big science, just to back up in the United States, it was essentially, the term was coined by the former Oak Ridge National Laboratory director, Alvin Weinberg, in a Journal of Science article. Obviously, it started, though, before that with things like the cyclotron at Lawrence Livermore National Lab being built out in Berkeley. And this era was the huge development era for the United States through the 1980s, really driven by the Cold War, driven by national security interests. Some of the features of sort of this big science era for the United States at the time was relatively limited international collaboration compared to the type of collaboration we see today, and also much faster pace of development, very different era in terms of safety and environmental requirements. Congressional funding was much easier to come by. There was more stability in funding from Congress. And this is when we saw, after World War II, the nuclear weapons national labs also expand in building a number of different open basic science user facilities. In the present day, we still see a large number of basic science, big science projects that are ongoing, although in terms of a quantitative basis, there are fewer that come online per decade than sort of the Cold War period. Funding oftentimes is delayed, or there's cost overruns, which leads to congressional oversight and further delays. We can see that, for example, the James Webb Telescope, which was over budget and not on time. And there's also a lot more of international open collaborative projects like CERN, like ITER in France, which is for nuclear fusion, and that's also a hallmark of type of the big science projects here today. And why does it matter? I've spent about a decade in the semiconductor industry, and if we think just about some of the fundamental innovation that's powering, say, fabricating the smallest microelectronics, a lot of that comes from the precision machinery. And that precision machinery, the most advanced and best example of that is what is known as extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. And this is relevant for China because these are export controlled. Not a single EUV machine has been exported to the PRC, nor have they had any access to them. And so for China, they're faced with this formidable task of re-innovating and recreating an EUV machine domestically. And it's proven to be incredibly difficult because they do not have the lab infrastructure and ecosystem that over 3-4 decades has fed into the innovation that has enabled this EUV machine. And so for the Chinese leadership in particular, it's these type of choke point technologies that are, whether it's in aerospace or quantum or microelectronics, that the West developed based upon these decades of basic science investments, have really underscored the necessity for catching up in that science infrastructure and ecosystem. For example, for an EUV machine, has precision engineering and mechanitronics using lightweight aluminum alloys that are all space grade. They have to move around on magnetic ball bearings at multiple Gs. They are refined down to a picometer level accuracy in terms of alignment. They have to be temperature resistant. They're using some of the world's most powerful laser-produced plasma, beam through some of the world's most precise optics with zero aberrations. And for example, those laser beams, they hit 10,000 drops of molten tin per second that implode. And so they had to do essentially nuclear weapons simulation of the physics and shockwave propagation from that molten tin using scientists from the national labs who worked for ASML in San Diego to be able to model the explosive characteristics of that plasma. That's the type of innovation that went into the creation and innovation of this extreme ultraviolet lithography machine. And so for China, trying to recreate it, they're trying to recreate it, but they're also understanding that they have to recreate this innovative ecosystem so that for future technologies, they are laying the groundwork for having that fundamental research capability that they can then transition into the private sector, into their economy, into their military. From a macro perspective, I mean, all the macro data shows, and I thought the Economist article from last year was a really good overview that looked at, China's qualitative and quantitative increase in both academic output and scientific domains and many different areas. For example, in material science, chemistry, Science Magazine, Nature Magazine, others are ranking China now as the world's most prolific innovator, also the most high quality innovator in terms of academic output. And of course, from a doctoral and graduate student perspective, we've all seen the macro statistics that show how China has invested heavily in science. In fact, this year, China and the United States will be about neck and neck in terms of net basic research development spending from a public expenditure perspective. If the budget request that the current administration put in place is accepted by Congress, and that's a big if, the U.S. will actually be in second place in terms of net basic R&D spending on a public expenditure basis. That's excluding private sector basic R&D, which the United States is still spending more than China in. However, from a public perspective, China is now basically neck and neck with the United States on a net basis. But overall, if we just look at the macro statistics, they do show a powerful picture, but they miss more recent developments, and they're not also looking at the developments that are happening on the ground. One major shift over the last several years has been an elevation of science within inside the party. And so in the 20th Party Congress, amongst many different priorities, one of the top priorities that Xi Jinping outlined was elevating the importance of strategic science self-sufficiency, or 科技自立自强. And as part of this, China created a new National Science Technology Commission. Previously, science inside China was largely, over the last 2 or 3 decades, a civilian affair. Obviously, during the 1950s and 60s, it was a party affair under the 2 bombs and 1 satellite program. But over the last, since reform and opening, science has become largely a civilian effort. It was managed by the State Council. However, in 2020, it became remanaged by the party with this new commission. Its membership is relatively unknown other than the director. There's been no public disclosure of who sits on the commission. The number of meetings they hold are not made public. That's slightly unusual, as many other CCP central commissions actually do publish their members, the when and how they have a meeting, the topics that they discuss. And this is also showing that in a sort of world with increased U.S.-China tensions, China is also more secretive around its science and technology policy. In fact, the 2020 to 2035 medium long-range plan, which is China's long-range plan for science technology development, has been referenced by many local governments, although it has never been made public. And when you ask the Minister of Science and Technology, like I did, where the plan is, he said, "We have no plan. What are you talking about?" So it's also in reaction to these tensions, China is moving to obfuscate a lot of their science technology plans. But overall, this shows that the party is elevating the importance of science. And we see this now at the local government level, at provinces, by mayors, who instead of holding meetings to build bridges or airports, are having party committee meetings in Wuxi or Nanjing or Xi'an around building a next laser facility or a new science park or a new science museum. And overall, science is being elevated to the point where every, for example, municipal level city and above, or DZSHIR, is required to build a science and technology museum. There's a science and technology law. There is a science and technology day. And there's just a huge national mobilization around increasing national awareness around the importance of science technology. It also means, however, that science is becoming slightly politicized, and scientists in China, I'll talk about this later, do have to spend more time as a good party member, going to party meetings, going to study sessions. And this is part of Xi Jinping's overall guidance to the scientists. One, he said that scientists have to walk with 2 feet. We all walk with 2 feet, but 1 foot has to walk in the direction of scientific objectives, and the other is to service the party and national rejuvenation. And scientists have to face 4 directions, as he said, or the 4个面向, which is face the party, face the nation, face the frontier of science, face the people. And so scientists have to think about how do they put in their budget requests, organize their programs in ways in which fit in within this. It's still a very broad framework, but it is starting to create more party governance over the science technology ecosystem. In fact, Xi Jinping, at a gathering of scientists in 2022, said importantly that all science is borderless, but scientists have a motherland, which is also around encouraging greater interaction between the diaspora and China's own science and technology ecosystem at home. And this is quite evident, this new CCP and Central Party leadership focus into science, just in the number of study tours and visits every time. For example, for those who study China, there is a monthly Politburo meeting, then the Politburo members all fan out, and then they visit the provinces. They give directives. They also learn about local conditions and how they can adopt central policy. And now virtually on every single one of those visits, whether it's Li Qiang or Xi Jinping, or others across the Politburo Standing Committee are visiting robotics firms, space labs, materials science facilities, agricultural research labs, and just in the sort of on a quantitative basis, the numbers have increased based upon some of the data that we've been collecting. In terms of S&T funding, there's also been a significant increase just on a net basis, of course, on a GDP and R&D, net R&D basis. China's overall investment on a percentage basis has increased. However, a lot of the funding for new programs at the local level, new labs, new science facilities are not included in those budgets. In fact, there is a new special line budget in 2024 from the State Council, which is for the two major strategic critical national security capability construction programs. That's a very long, arcane word, but $150 billion extra long-term bonds were issued to include national science technology infrastructure. And now the China Development Bank as well is allocating up to $200 billion for this loan program. And what we're seeing is that a lot of the new scientific facilities that are being built are getting some central funding, but also a lot of local funding and funding lines from these credit facilities that are being established to help support local S&T development across China. And a lot of this is focused on building out national laboratory capabilities. In fact, Xi Jinping in 2015, this shows how he's actually been personally focused for quite some time on what he perceives are the successful US labs like Los Alamos, Argonne, Lawrence, Berkeley, that revolve around national missions, essentially serving the nation and national security capabilities. And there's been several instances where he's given guidance or directives at the two sessions or the National People's Congress or different Politburo meetings where he continually says and points to, look at how the United States has been successful in building their national lab ecosystem. We should be creating something similar with Chinese characteristics. Historically, within China, they've had their China Academy of Sciences, which under it has about 100 plus different institutes. However, they have had sort of historical stovepipe issues, bureaucratic issues, and intra-caste bureaucracy that has led to some stagnant research results. And so China, I think, is actually quite aware of this and has sought to create new labs outside of the China Academy of Sciences to create more competition and pressure on everyone to be more innovative and competitive. In fact, there's been a new effort to create something called New National Laboratories, or 新型实验室. And these are local government-funded labs in partnership with standard enterprises and research institutes that are domain-focused, much like a federally funded research center in the United States, like MIT Lincoln Labs or Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, where they might work on classified government programs in the military, they might partner with the private sector, but they usually focus on one domain, either AI or quantum or aerospace. And there's about 200 of these new research labs across China that are either under construction, operating, or planned. And China has been making also large strides in big science. Over the last several years, China has built and operated a lot of new scientific infrastructure. For example, in Guangdong province,
China is building the world's largest neutrino lab that will be looking at new type of physics problems. Or in Western China, in Sichuan, China is building the world's deepest laboratory to explore dark matter, which is a very important physics domain. The U.S. has been a leader in this. Its next generation facility has not been funded by Congress, ours. Or, of course, you've probably seen some of the reports around China's is now operating the world's largest fast radio telescope for exploring, radio signals from space, which has a number of different domain applications. China, like everything, has a 5-year plan for national science technology infrastructure. In the 13th 5-year plan, they created the medium long range plan for national science technology basic infrastructure. And since the 13th 5-year plan, there's been a 5-year sub-plan for national science technology labs. And in every 5-year plan, they've essentially been doubling their metrics for the amount of new labs and facilities that they like to be built. So under the 14th 5-year plan, there's 20 new big science facilities planned. This period ends next year. The plan before that, it was 10. The plan before that, it was 5. The 15th 5-year plan, if we might see a similar either significant increase or doubling. Most of the facilities are multi-purpose, everything from solar energy to life sciences to aerospace to fusion energy, nuclear weapons science, quantum computing, and many of these facilities are actually under construction. In fact, this 14th 5-year plan for basic science infrastructure is not public, but there are many local mayors and governors who are very excited when their project was part of the plan. And so you can just add them all up and figure out what their plan looks like. Their approval process for building this large science technology infrastructure, as I mentioned, there is a medium long range plan that's managed by the National Development and Reform Commission. They are the central hub inside China, not their Ministry of Science Technology, but it's NDRC that is managing this process. There's a 5-year plan that is also managing each 5-year period. And while we think of China as a top-down country with a lot of planning, a lot of the ideas for which scientific devices and infrastructure and labs to build come from the scientists themselves. And within China, there is a very strong culture around senior scientists who obtain party government ranking. And so if you're elected to the Chinese Academy of Engineering, it's a very prestigious role inside China. You're given a vice ministerial ranking inside the state council, and then you're given a party affiliation as well. You have a driver, a car, a budget, a secretary. You get priority access to government programs. You get invited to things like the Beidaihe summer session to brief the Central Committee and the Politburo members. And oftentimes, each government lab or program is usually led by a academician or a yuanshi across China. And there's about 100 plus of these academicians. There's been a lot of corruption in this program historically, as many of them also run companies on the side. And so there has been an anti-corruption drive effort to try and weed some of that out. But, I think they've been hesitant to go too deep, with the exception of some of the military domains, particularly in the rocket forces. So it's bottom up, not top down. And one large benefit that they have is there's no Congress to go through. And so they don't have to go convince somebody from, say, the Kentucky delegation that was a real estate developer, doesn't know anything about science, and beg for funding like our national labs and Department of Energy does. And so the approval process is much quicker. And many of these are being built on a sort of from idea to approval to break ground basis, sometimes in a 1 or 2 year time frame. Other more complex projects are longer, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Some of the examples of some of the new facilities that China is building are really garnering a lot of international attention. If you talk to scientists in each of these domains, I've met with a number of the different scientific societies, are actually really excited about them, as that many of them are going to be open user facilities, much like those in the United States. International scientific collaboration is being encouraged, and China is inviting international scientists to actually take part in the design of these facilities. They participate in the approval of them, and so then they can also open up the facilities to them and attract global scientists to work on cutting edge problems. So a couple examples. China's building a new burning plasma fusion reactor, which is a high pressure tokamak facility. But what you see in the picture actually is not the tokamak fusion reactor, but an entire lab and facility just revolving around the supply chains for building superconducting magnets. China is investing a lot in new nuclear fission and nuclear physics science. So, for example, China is building a heavy ion accelerator facility in southern China, a new fusion stellarator lab. And I've not been to these three facilities, but I did talk to some scientists who've been to them, and the construction quality is also significantly increased. There is not a lot of corner cutting anymore, and they're bringing in the best instrumentation, the best equipment from Germany, from the United States to kit out a lot of their facilities. And so these are not vanity projects in many cases, like some of the labs in the past in China were. For example, this is the new heavy ion accelerator facility. It's at a mountaintop. They cleared the mountaintop, which I always, Chinese construction is always impressive. And behind it are 4 nuclear power plants that are being built concurrently. This is on China's east coast, as China doesn't build nuclear power plants in the interior yet. China, you may have read earlier in January, Reuters had a report that showed China's building the world's largest laser ignition facility. So if you've been following fusion science, in 2022, the Department of Energy had net gain fusion for the first time, which is more energy was generated than went in using powerful lasers. And at China's nuclear weapons facility in Western China, China is building a much larger version of that. Now, our Department of Energy uses the National Ignition Facility primarily for nuclear weapons simulation and effects testing as well. And so no surprise this is being located in Western China at Cape as well. But it's essentially just based on the physical footprint, about 4 times the size, which will allow China to simulate much higher yields in a controlled environment for both fusion ignition, but also for nuclear weapons effects and other type of materials science projects. In the high energy physics, China is building around a dozen new advanced light sources. So advanced light sources are really important for characterizing new materials in life sciences, using X-rays, flash photography, and other type of light to be able to do materials characterization. Up until about 2018, most Chinese researchers were conducting their high energy physics and materials characterization experiments on US light sources. Those were essentially shut down in the first Trump administration, and China is now rebuilding basically each and every one of our light accelerators and sources domestically inside China. The new Beijing Synchrotron light source is now operational. They had their first light. The equivalent would be Argonne National Lab's photonic light source. It's about equal to in capability the Argonne National Lab facility. This is also under construction in China. It's a new soft X-ray free electron laser that's being developed. It skims several mountaintops. It's like a mile long. But it'll be the first of its kind in the world. It'll be much more powerful than smaller laser facilities that are in Germany and in the United States. There's also a lot of other innovative. So there's Shanghai is building a large underground hard X-ray laser, attosecond lasers. I mean, and these are sort of arcane and obtuse in some areas, but they do matter for all different types of scientific domains. And for example, the new SHINE facility in Shanghai, the scientists at Argonne did have an ability to go out and visit, and they were incredibly wowed by it. And their takeaway is that this will likely win China a Nobel Prize in science because there's nothing like it anywhere else in the world, and it's going to be able to open up a lot of new domains for material science research. And this is starting to excite the scientific community, all this different construction and activity. And it's going to, particularly with Europe, with the global south, perhaps become a new hub for scientific collaboration. China has also proposed to build basically a CERN on steroids, the world's largest particle accelerator. It has not been formally approved by the State Council, but they're moving on all the sort of proof of concept engineering requirements to be approved, and it will likely be approved in the 15 five-year plan. So it'll be around 100 kilometers instead of 50 kilometers circumference that CERN is. Research that's happening in areas hypergravity. So, for example, you've seen the movies where the astronauts spin around really fast to simulate gravitational forces. This is undersea, in space, or on ground, and about 1,000 times more powerful than the facilities NASA and the Air Force have. And it's an entire city block outside of Hangzhou. Quantum detection, quantum science. And as a result of this and many other factors, there's no surprise that, talent, not just Chinese diaspora talent, but global scientific talent, is being quite interested and enticed in access to state-of-the-art facilities, state-of-the-art research, almost unlimited funding. And, while China certainly has its own politics around science, it's very different than the politics currently here in the United States around science, where it's, arguably more welcomed and more embraced from a national strategic culture perspective. Now, what all these facilities will do is create data, and that's essentially what science facilities do, is they create lots of data that scientists then use for their different experiments and simulations. That requires access to a lot of computing, and what scientists now are talking about is using AI for science, basically moving all of that data into a large language model and training your own large language model based upon scientific data so that you can accelerate the pace of scientific discovery. And China is very much embracing this concept. AI for Science is a national project under China's own National Science Foundation. And so that's sort of a twofold then priority. One is building the computing infrastructure. And so China really views computing infrastructure as a national infrastructure, as part of their science technology infrastructure. And so there is a national data center program under what's called the Eastern Data Western Compute Program, where China is building 10 regional clusters for data centers that will serve a lot of these government and science labs' computing needs. And scientific computing traditionally needs a very specific type of computing architecture, which is known as high precision. So you can simulate things with a lot of fidelity, but AI is actually a different type of computing paradigm that's using lower precision. And so you need a different type of computing. So the government's having to, much like the data centers in the United States and the build out around NVIDIA and AI and inference, China's also expanding heavily in this space. And no surprise, inside China's scientific community, there are intense efforts to develop and use large language models, by integrating a lot of that scientific data that's going to be coming out of their new scientific facilities. And Chinese scientists are developing large language models for everything from computational fluid dynamic simulation, earthquake prediction, aerospace design, and there are now dedicated centers for AI inside a number of China's own research institutes. For example, there's a new national lab in southern China known as Pengcheng Labs. They're in partnership with the Shenzhen government and Huawei. They have around 3,200 researchers just established in 2019. They have a brand new campus designed by an architectural firm that's here in Boston that designed many MIT buildings, which is funny. And they're developing their own large language models. One of them, for example, is called the Nebula System, which they're using China Academy of Sciences astrophysics data collected from their radio telescopes to essentially build a radio telescope large language model expert who can answer any and all questions you need around all the different astrophysics data that they've been collecting. Another example is Zhejiang Lab outside of Hangzhou. This is one of these new national labs. It's actually in collaboration with Pengcheng Labs and Alibaba. So Alibaba's CTO is the president of this lab. They're much like a FFRDC. They do classified research for the Chinese military. They have their own supercomputer, and they're doing a lot around computing in space. So for example, they are putting a spaceborne computing network on low Earth orbit satellites and focusing a lot on using AI to limit the amount of satellite uplink and downlink so that, for example, for their geospatial and imagery satellites, they can analyze the imagery on board and only send down the images to Earth that you need, not all of them, which extends your life cycle of the satellite and also limits the amount of bandwidth they're using for communications. And so this is, a lot of really interesting and innovative use cases showing it's not just around basic science, but it's also applied for many different military applications. In terms of the macro environment, though, I've talked about increase in funding. the increase in party awareness and focus on science and technology, increase in terms of funding, this new national lab build out. However, there are two, challenges that China is also facing, or arguably a third that I can also mention. The first, of course, is as the party becomes more involved, that does mean that scientists have to spend more time doing party building, going to party sessions. In fact, earlier in January of this year, every scientist leading every institute in Shanghai had to spend 3 days at a study session on learning all the important things that Xi Jinping has to say to be a smart, patriotic scientist. Last I checked, he doesn't have a science degree, so it's, wondering what he could contribute other than political ideology. Or scientists at the Hefei Burning Plasma Fusion Lab had to spend 2 weeks at a party building conference in Western China. And so, I would argue this is probably not the best use of scientists' time. They're probably best left alone to just do what scientists do, which is work in the lab and innovate, collaborate with each other. And it also means that they will have to orient new objectives around party goals. In fact, there was a TV show about 2 or 3 years ago that came out on Chinese Central Television, which is around the travails and hardships of famous Chinese scientists throughout the several decades. And it was a documentary about a Chinese scientist who led the program to put China's first satellite into space. And there was a scene where all the scientists were arguing over the payload. It was too heavy, and it was not ready for launch. And they were, talking about different ways they could produce the payload. And the camera panned back to the satellite and it had 1,000 Mao Zedong pins on it. And they couldn't remove the pins, but they had to remove different scientific instrumentation. Obviously, that's an extreme, but it was interesting that even inside the Chinese system, they were acknowledging this. But we're seeing a little bit of reverse back to that with increased in party ideology. The second challenge, of course, is around funding. And while funding appears to be ubiquitous, China does face the overall national constraint of slowing economic development. And some of these scientific projects are duplicative, wasteful, and do run into funding challenges, particularly those that are funded primarily by the local government. In fact, Zhejiang Labs 2 years ago had to furlough a lot of their staff members as the party secretary who supported this left, went to another province. The new party secretary wasn't that excited about it, put fundings elsewhere. Then they had to plead with the new party secretary and they got their funding back. But it shows that you can be both exposed to politics and funding, much like in any other geography. And China's not alone. However, as long as science technology is remaining a top priority, I find it difficult that China is going to reduce overall national science technology budget. Essentially, my perspective is that China is willing to extend the retirement age, minimize social pensions for building more science facilities and infrastructure, as they believe this is more important to China's overall long-term national objectives. The third challenge as well is around international openness and collaboration. And obviously, the United States over the last several years in many different realms has been engaged in a policy of decoupling in scientific and technological domains. And that has put pressure on Chinese scientists. It has limited their access to US user facilities. The Department of Energy and the national labs are much less open to collaboration with China than they were in the past. In fact, just for example, being a Chinese citizen working at U.S. national labs, of which there are many up until recently, has become quite challenging. And of course, the China Initiative, many other areas, export controls. What that has meant is China shifted a lot of their international collaborative focus towards Europe and the global South, which have increased scrutiny in some parts of Europe, but overall not anywhere to the extent of the United States, and nor have other global South players. And so we can see sort of China shifting their scientific focus. For example, China announced a number of new scientific collaborations with the Middle East, with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia. The Most Minister recently traveled to the UAE, and Saudi Arabia announced new partnerships in AI and quantum and aerospace. And those nations are also very hungry for talent, and that's something that China can help deliver, is young scientific talent that can fill out a lot of these labs. that have access to Western networks as well. And so that's quite attractive for China. But these three areas are going to be, I believe, over the next 5-10 years, both funding, policy and ideology, and international openness a challenge for China. On the flip side, China is also imposing more restrictions on its own scientists and the type of data that it can share, the type of work that it can engage with. For example, China has a new law that requires all bulk scientific data has to be reviewed by the government before exported outside of China. So if you're a Chinese scientist and you have a new large data set that you have created with a radio telescope or with a human organ simulation center, and you want to publish it in an international journal, it has to be reviewed by the security authorities before you make that data available to international researchers. And this is actually quite burdensome for the Chinese scientific community. Many scientists are openly and publicly complaining about these new onerous restrictions. And I myself have been in meetings where it's been between US and Chinese policy and experts to discuss science policy. And there was a Chinese scientist who just railed to a vice minister at most around the burdensome regulations. And so the fact they'd be willing to do that in front of a foreign audience, in front of directly to the vice minister, meant that it's starting to have a significant impact. Counterintelligence, the national security law, has meant that many different forms of scientific collaboration mean you're going to get a phone call or a knock on the door from the security authorities if you're sharing data or engaging in international collaboration in a way in which the Ministry of State Security might perceive as a risk. But overall, the major push is going to, I believe, deliver significant benefits for China's economic, national security, and technological advancement. And it's going to help push China towards the scientific frontier. I think it's very easy to see how China is attempting to replicate the success that the United States has had in building out a national science enterprise, and how big science national labs are revolving around national missions. Work on problems that the private sector won't fund, but ultimately benefit the private sector because that spillover effect, whether it's in GPS or semiconductors, is quite strong. In many of these areas, China will be at the cutting edge, building scientific research labs and facilities that can simulate different scientific properties and create data in ways that other facilities around the world cannot. And that will attract some of the brightest minds to work together with Chinese scientists on cross-cutting international global research. So happy to share with you some of the thoughts and the research and my sort of perspective around Chinese science and technology policy today. And then we'll go into a Q&A at the end. I've got one more slide here. It'll come up. There we go. Questions and discussion. Yeah.
Thanks, Jimmy. Okay, please raise your hand. Sam, I saw you first. Do you get the first question?
Thanks for a really educational talk. I learned a lot from it, and I had a few questions. I'll stick to one for rules. I'm wondering, you made a sort of offhand comment about differences between U.S. and Chinese strategic culture and the value of science. What do you see as a difference in sort of the value of science and strategic culture, and what do you see China doing to promote that to the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, overall, East Asia overall, thinking broader than just China, there is I'd say a much stronger societal recognition around the importance of science, the objectivity of it, and then the government's willingness to embrace scientific input as a critical policy input, whether it's in life sciences, or in many different domains, and it's sort of a more, I'd say it's a more recent phenomenon in the United States, clearly with, what we're seeing in national science policy and higher education, So I think from a Chinese perspective, they might watch some of what's happening in the United States and, be quite puzzled.
Looks that way for the United States too.
Yeah.
All right, we'll come back to you if we have more time for more questions. Thanks for your discipline. Ian.
Fantastic discussion. How would you characterize the effect of U.S. science policy, specifically on AI chips, with Chinese advancement, right? So we banned sale of black-owned chips back in 2022, and now famously the Chinese have come back and saying we're not interested in any NVIDIA chips anymore because we're working on our own stuff. Is it the case where our actions have actually escalated Chinese scientific advancement, or if it's just natural course they've continued to advance, not thinking about us?
Yeah, I mean, in the semiconductor space, China has had essentially an every 5-year plan since the 1980s, and even prior to that, development of indigenous integrated circuits or semiconductor industry as a national priority. And prior to all U.S. export controls, China in 2015 announced the world's largest sovereign wealth fund for semiconductor development, established a dozen new state-owned enterprises, tried to acquire leading U.S. companies like Micron, National Instruments, Western Digital, and has made semiconductor self-sufficiency a national priority. However, even in that sort of pre-2022 or export control era, China's efforts were targeted around certain segments of the semiconductor industry, and they were thinking long-term. The export controls, once they were introduced, meant China accelerated and broadened its efforts. The big question today is around, can China produce sufficient quality and quantity of AI accelerators relevant, for the quote AI race? China today, actually, their most advanced indigenous AI chip was not produced in China. It was produced in Taiwan. Huawei's most advanced AI chip was built upon smuggled access to silicon from TSMC, which was not supposed to happen. And so what matters is, can China build a chip that on a watt per watt performance basis is as good as NVIDIA? And then how many of them can they build? And on both of those metrics, they're behind significantly. If you read the People's Daily, it says they're ahead, and I think NVIDIA agrees with that. But actually, if you measure it more objectively, China, their biggest challenge is they don't have access to this advanced machinery where they cannot fabricate at the smaller transistor size, those semiconductors, which means they have to use more wafer area to be able to overcompensate for that. And they have limited production without those machines. So it's kind of a self-reinforcing challenge of low output in terms of quality and quantity. Obviously, China is an amazing nation, and making all these huge investments over time, they will close those gaps. But then they're shooting at a moving target. So, for example, in extreme ultraviolet lithography, China's trying to recreate the system that these Dutch companies were able to build in 2008. They're already on the 3rd generation of that system with much more advanced features that will require a whole other generation of investment and innovation by China. So, one of the other elements in this is, instead of not only throwing sand in the gears to buy some time, but also leveraging that time to run faster and make the investments in our own innovation ecosystem so that we're making use of whatever time those export controls might buy. That's all they really do, is they buy you some time, and that's about it. And you can't forever slow someone's scientific progress.
So to build on Ian's question for a minute and to connect basic science to application, I realize it's probably an impossible question to ask. You can just say, Taylor, this is an impossible thing, but what would you estimate would be the time it would take China to realize the fruits of the basic science progress to be converted into applications, for example, in semiconductors?
Yeah.
Just in sense, I think.
Yeah.
Just I know you know.
In some areas, it will be quite immediate. In other areas, it will be more long-term. For example, in, say, photolithography or in optical metrology, which is a really important area, essentially being able to inspect and look at the wafer to see how many defects at really high speed and accuracy at the nanometer level requires really advanced understanding of optics and laser and e-beams and other things. That's an area where China's traditionally been behind in. It'll probably take 5-7 years to translate all the investment in these labs and research into actual economic advancement. But in general, it's that 5-7 year period to get the lab up and running, programs going, the workforce cycling through the lab into the companies. But that's actually not a long time if you think in sort of longer time frames.
Christine?
Hi, thank you for the talk. You talked about this sort of bottom-up process and local experimentation. I was wondering if you can talk about how does the central government manage, I guess, the trade-off between like more monitoring versus letting the localities experiment? Do you think just doing more party building activities are enough or sufficient? Do you think are there any other ways for the party to sort of monitor what's going on?
Well, I mean, most importantly, through the new Science and Technology Commission, they're establishing a sort of a central nexus for oversight and coordination of science policy. Each province and city is establishing their own parallel Central Science Technology Commission. And some of the more important municipalities are also establishing them. And then, party committees in each of the different science labs have a more pronounced importance. In fact, there was research by Merix and the Max Planck Institute of Science that showed how over the last 5 years, the role of the party secretary in scientific labs has been elevated. Traditionally, it's been the civilian administrator in, say, a Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute of High Energy Physics or maritime science that has had project and budgetary and personnel authority. Increasingly now, the party secretary role is making those decisions instead of the civilian administrator. And so that also means that the party lines of control are more direct now in basic things like promotions, advancement, and budget priorities. Now, many of those party members are scientists themselves, and so it's basically they're wearing just a different hat, but it does mean they have to think around what is Xi Jinping guidance for science and technology? What is the party committee in Shanghai said around science technology objectives? On the other side, you could argue that helps the scientists gain more prominence, more funding, access to national strategic programs than they would have otherwise. So I think it has both benefits and drawbacks. In terms of the bottom-up experimentation, a good example would be in, say, for China's particle accelerator, there are a lot of local governments that really want that project in their province. And so they've been out almost like a investment promotion bureau trying to market themselves to the lead Chinese scientists and an experts committee that's going to decide where that particle accelerator is going to be located. And so you see local provinces vying for funding. They throw tax breaks, incentives. They'll say, we'll build an entire city for this project. We'll build dorms, schools, hospitals. And so you get a lot of intra-provincial competition for these vanguard science infrastructure projects as well.
Yes. Jim Walsh.
I enjoyed your talk very much. And I thought you laid out the pillars, the institutional and political priority, the funding, the people, right? Each of these blocks as they build this thing. And my question might be beyond your expertise, but it's a comparative question. China's not the first country to say it wants to be a leader in science. And so, do you know anything about other countries' efforts that would tell you whether they're likely to be successful or not? Of those different pillars, some may be more important than others. Obviously, not every country is comparable. Maybe it's different catching up today than it was catching up in the past. But anything that can sort of locate China compared to others who have tried to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think China's clearly benchmarking itself relatively against the United States. And the United States was very successful, and particularly in the post-World War II era, at investing in its labs, its universities through federally funded research. What's also really important in the United States is intellectual property around who owns the IP that comes out of universities and labs. In the United States, it's a relatively, I'd say, mature, clear system, although there's still challenges, but it's better than what the system is in China. Another really important factor that the U.S., I believe, is still an advantage is its venture capital ecosystem, where you're able to have good financially oriented investors be able to take ideas out of the labs, provide them with startup capital, and move them into the private sector. The venture capital community in China was, up until very recently, very privately driven by wealthy Chinese private entrepreneurs inside internet companies, and also foreign venture capital. So Silver Lake, many other venture capital companies were up until recently very active in China. The combination of geopolitical tensions plus China's own crackdown on the private internet economy really stifled a lot of that investment, and it exited China, or they remain dormant. There's been a resurgence with sort of China's DeepSeek moment, but overall, that's an area where I think China doesn't have as mature of an ecosystem. Is they've got a lot of money, but a lot of the money is run by venture capital companies in China that have government liquidity partners, and they have just a different mindset. They want to see jobs in their local municipality. They only want to support companies in their city. They just look at things differently than a more market-oriented investor would. And so one could argue that might be a weakness inside the Chinese system as well. And then, the other point, I think if you look at countries like Germany, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Israel, which have become also significant contributors to global science, from day one, they were integrated inside the global scientific ecosystem, knowing that on their own, they could not become a self-sufficient science superpower. And that's sort of China's, both ambition, but also drawback might be that they're trying to do too much all internally, and are much more restrictive on their own domestic scientists than arguably some of the other developed economies are.
Diane.
Great. Hi, Ajay. Thank you very much for this talk. I have many questions. Nice to see you in person as well. But I will ask one for the sake of time. What do you think, from the U.S. perspective, all of this Chinese great scientific stride that you mentioned, can the U.S. benefit from any of these?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that China remains open, and much of its scientific output is still published, the U.S. can benefit from that. To the extent that the U.S. and China might jointly contribute to large scientific endeavors like ITER, CERN. These are huge projects where no one country can on its own perhaps engage in some of the engineering challenges, scientific challenges. In life sciences, there's obviously a lot of opportunity in renewable and green energy. Just in the current political environment, it's very, very challenging. I mean, that's an understatement. But when I talk to national labs and scientists in the United States, they themselves are very worried about collaborating with China, and Chinese scientists are very worried because the security elements in both countries, it's not just in the United States. We read a lot about the China Initiative and counterintelligence efforts here in the United States. It's equal or more intense in China on Chinese scientists. If you're in when I was visiting a Chinese science lab, and every elevator was a poster of "Catch the Foreign Spies," and I felt very awkward in that elevator. And just and so it's there's a national counterintelligence day, and on national TV they talk about these Chinese scientists who met too many foreign friends, and it's really oppressive, but it's really targeted on U.S. scientific collaboration. So I think both countries have to tone that back. It's not just the United States, it's also China, for that to work. And there's really, unfortunately, no short-term pullback of that likely. We'll see though.
Kenway.
Sure. A great talk, Jimmy. I've noticed that the arguments you were making, for example, in response to top-down, bottom-up, the examples that you're choosing are from semiconductors through colliders, big science, a little bit on AI. There was no discussion of life sciences and biology, which is another area of competition. And the question that I have, and there's kind of a little follow-up on it, but to what extent is the story the same for the life sciences as it is for the examples that you were giving, or is it different because what you have is certainly the big physical facilities, BGI sitting in Shenzhen, but you also have more subtle things going on, iGen, with tons of students coming internationally to compete. You also have 1,000 Talents playing a large role there. You also have differences in regulation, intellectual property rights, but ownership of the genomic and health records data that has to be used to do the biological engineering to target it. Question basically is it different in the life sciences, or is the story that you've told one that fits best for energy and semiconductors and the hard stuff?
Yeah, so in the sort of hard sciences and material science, chemistry,
Yeah.
many other areas, that I think that story that I told is relatively constant across different domains. In life sciences, um, there's a similar amount of effort and investment being made. There are a lot of national efforts underway around a national brain science initiative. I think that China saw how the U.S. brain science initiative in the 90s really propelled the United States to be a global leader in neuroscience. So China in Shenzhen and Beijing has a local effort. There's a national effort. There's BGI, but there's a lot of work on, say, human organ growth. I mean, there's just lots of efforts in the life sciences. There, it is more open. There's a stronger commercial collaboration as well. And there's, I think, less sensitivity on both the commercial and academic side globally around collaboration because it's seen as more beneficial to humanity. Who minds where their next medicine or life-saving cure might come from? There is, though, a strong supply chain concern in the United States around dependency on things like, precursors for pharmaceuticals or biologics, some of the machinery and diagnostic equipment. And there are people, for example, that propose the Biosecure Act in the United States. It's the International Security Commission on Biotechnology that are quite active in this area. But they're kind of up against huge, powerful financial interests that want to continue accessing the best low cost type of research they can. And
you there.
yeah, but it's not an area that I've delved in as much as the hard sciences. But from what I have seen and looked at, there's some key similarities and differences.
Damien.
Oh, okay. So thank you for the great talk. I'm more curious about the motivation and decision-making parts behind China's science and tech policy. So, for example, I want to know how do Chinese policymakers make decisions or make assessment on the strategic salience of certain technologies, and how do they decide on prioritizing like certain demands, for example, like AI, semiconductor, new energy, rather than others? It's all about competing with the United States, or are there any other considerations that are?
So, national rejuvenation and modernization is a major overriding goal, but there are many goals that have to do with China's own domestic situation as well. So, for example, amongst China's science and technology priorities, you see international prestige, overall just technological and scientific frontier pushing towards that as a source of national pride, and also benefits that might help military modernization. Those are really important priorities. And you see projects in those areas funded very quickly, funding allocated very aggressively. For example, the laser ignition facility, its primary objective is nuclear weapons science. And that's being funded very, very aggressively and moving quickly. Approvals were very quick. In a few other areas, though, you see similar priorities at an equal level of prioritization around environmental technology. So there's a heavy amount of investment into things like clean water, clean air. Agricultural safety is another area that China is investing heavily in. Transportation science. So, for example, mega engineering around high-speed rail, aerospace, are other priorities. Aging, life sciences, human health, communicable diseases. In fact, the priorities that Xi Jinping has laid out, they are, national security, human well-being, and safety, life sciences, agriculture, and energy are sort of the areas that they consistently talk about. And then overall modernization of China's infrastructure and smart infrastructure. And so, for example, there's several new national labs that are just focused on railway engineering, where, for example, if you want to have magnetic levitation or maglev trains, you need to do a lot of aerodynamic modeling of the trains at high speeds going through tunnels. You have a lot of radio interference, and so they build huge simulation facilities to be able to simulate maglev trains at high speeds, so then they can fix a lot of those engineering problems before they do them on a larger scale. So it's really quite diverse. Oceanographic science is actually a large priority for China. Maritime science. So, for example, I'm a senior fellow at UG ICCC at San Diego, I've done a lot of collaboration with Scripps, which Scripps Institute is one of the world-leading institutes in oceanographic science, and China's building huge fleets of ocean survey vessels, working on deep sea mining. Going to build a cold water, deep water scientific lab that'll hold 20 scientists year round. At undersea, deep sea depths. And that's also linked to China's strong maritime power, national priority, and many of their naval modernization efforts, as well as surveying the ocean floor benefits many things, including undersea warfare. So a lot of these have many different, like most basic science domains, have dual use applications.
Very closely.
So you spoke to this already a little bit in terms of movement of discovery to the private sector. I wonder if you could say just a bit more about how the fruits of this research are shared laterally among these various Chinese institutions, and then vertically, and also how basic science moves into this is the same question, but it might work differently among domains. How basic science moves into applied.
Mm-hmm.
So, what the sheer volume of what you presented makes you think, well, gee, are these people really all going to share with each other? Is the purpose of these party meetings to get them to share with each other? Who garners the benefits of private time? It just seems like there's a whole lot of issues there, and people are not always generous with their own findings. So, I'm just wondering what I know you spoke to this once already, so I feel bad asking the second time, but I feel like I'd like to hear a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, there's certainly intra competition amongst different institutes, and historically, as I mentioned, stovepiping and competition, bureaucratic turf politics between institutes has been a major impediment. The Chinese scientific officials, provincial and local level science committees talk openly about that challenge and the need to reform and fix it. And they've spent a lot of time not becoming perfect, but they're improving their system. For example, accountability mechanisms so that funding priorities are public and the results of funding are made public. They try and organize different research institutes together to collaborate on national mega projects. So their centrally administered science programs are around the key national R&D program, their basic R&D program, and national mega projects. And generally, they never want one institute to work on them alone. They will have a consortia that they'll build. They'll have scientific review committees, feasibility studies where they're all working together. So they do try and encourage that collaboration. In fact, there's a new mechanism they've created called Innovation Consortia, or 创新联合体, where for things like tritium fuel cycle for fusion or next generation aerospace aircraft development, they're bringing state-owned enterprises, national labs, and academics at universities all together to work jointly on these problems. Another sort of impediment that they've looked at is meritocracy, and an issue of scientific funding being hoarded by essentially scientists that should have retired maybe 5-10 years ago, but they continue to remain in their posts. And so they have a new requirement that all new national mega projects, the principal investigator has to be under 40. They're making a big push to try and lower the average age of basically scientific output as well. They've looked at the hard statistics, and that most Nobel Prizes are won by scientists in the fundamental work was in their 20s or 30s. And they want to get those younger scientists in more of a decision-making and principal investigator role as well. As you can see, they openly recognize that these type of challenges exist, and they're very focused on trying to fix them. Like many things in China, though, there's a counter fix, and then, people figure out ways to get around the different, for example, Xi Jinping had a requirement that said, as a government employee several years ago, you can only eat 4 dishes and 1 soup. And I literally had in a government cafeteria 16 dishes and 4 soups because they created little mini dishes inside the 4 dishes. So, there are definite ways when, you know, the central government tries to impose systems and hierarchy that people end up getting around them. And, you know, corruption is still a plaguing issue. You know, despite Xi Jinping's ongoing revolving anti-corruption purges, surprise, surprise, there continues to be corruption even within their anti-corruption, you know, elements, especially within their anti-corruption element. You know, there's been, you know, they have these, you know, inspection tours that go to different standard enterprises and labs, and turns out that those are some of the most corrupt officials, are the people leading the corruption tours, because they get bought off by different officials to look the other way, and that still happens, even like last year. You know, it's and so these challenges can exist, but they're very open and recognizing that they are challenges that need to be reformed, and they're working hard at them.
Reminds me of, right, the saying in Chinese, the superiors have policies and the underlings have
Yes.
countermeasures.
Yeah, yeah.
Sounds
上有
better.
对策，下有对策。Yeah.
Maria.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could comment a bit more on brain drain specifically. So you mentioned that China wants to approach this in a more national kind of way. On the other hand, you've also mentioned scientists who are being drawn to China. The giant infrastructure projects you've mentioned are sort of very attractive to foreign scientists, but on the other hand, I'm assuming the study sessions about party ideology might not be. So
yeah, I mean, the benefit for a foreign scientist is you just will never go to those study sessions because you're not invited. You know, sorry, you know, you.
I love a good study.
Yes, and you don't have to.
Yeah, we will. It's going to be a month.
And you don't have to install an app where you're quizzed every week around new party ideology and given a test score. And your merit improvement and your you know, different advancement in your career is going to be based not only on your scientific output, but, you know, your party ideology. So, you know, from you know, different anecdotes that I understand and from different scientists that I've spoken to, you know, if you know what China's really interested in are having really high profile, retired, in many cases, Nobel laureates travel to China, given honorary titles. They give lectures. They're not really involved in the day-to-day research, and that helps with China's credibility. And they don't have to get involved in the deep management of these programs. And so that's one area that, you know, China is actively trying to encourage to come to China. Second are, you know, up and coming researchers who, you know, might have their programs seeing funding cuts in the West. And, you know, China might come to them and say, look, you know, we will fund this 10 times over. You will have none of the challenges you have in the United States. There are a few drawbacks, though, you know, in overall, just as is sort of, you know, in any Chinese workplace. One is sort of the hours you're expected to work are known as the 996 culture, a lot more intense. You know, for a scientist who's really committed to the cause, they might be working 24 hours a day in some cases, even outside of China. So that may not be a problem. But, you know, there's really not a lot of free time for hiking or whatever hobby you might have inside a, you know, Chinese workplace. And that's definitely prevalent in government institutions and labs. Another major issue amongst Chinese scientific labs and other workplaces around discrimination, both gender discrimination, other issues, and in particular, there's been a lot of actually high-profile cases around female scientists in China running into a lot of issues of, you know, glass ceiling or workplace discrimination. And inside the Chinese system, there's just not a really good outlet for any of that. And so, you know, we're seeing more men than women in some cases go back to China because of different gender issues and ties inside the Chinese workplaces. And that is a major impediment, I think, for China, because they're just not as advanced, and it's very open. I mean, Xi Jinping has basically made any women's rights organization a legal organization at the same time. So there's really no outlet for any of those issues, like there is arguably better in the West than in China.
Right. Thank you. One of the risks inherent in centrally directed science is the possibility of glaring catastrophes. I mean, the cardinal example is what Lysenko did to Soviet agriculture in the 30s. Has there been anything quite like that in the history of Chinese science?
I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I was talking to a group of scientists at a national lab, and they were saying, the best part of the US system is you can have a couple of postdocs in sandals in a lab come up with an idea and get it funded from NSF, and then that comes into a startup, and great ideas come from, the very bottom sometimes. Um, Most of the time, if not all the time. The challenge, of course, in China is going to be, are some of these large engineering projects going to be, vanity projects, or even worse, they might fund things that should never be funded. One counter argument there, for example, in life sciences, China is really cognizant and has actually, after, for anyone who's following, He Jiankui is a famous Chinese life scientist who worked to genetically engineer several babies around a genetic disorder. And China actually responded quite vigorously to that. They cracked down on the scientists. They put them in jail for a few years. They instituted new laws. So they are worried around scientific ethics. As China recognizes, if they're going to be a scientific superpower, they cannot be seen as a unethical Chinese superpower. And people are not going to want to collaborate with China if they perceive that scientific ethics are not going to be observed. So there's actually been a large focus on ethics amongst China's scientific community. In fact, there's a Central Scientific Ethical Commission that's under the direction of the new Science Committee, and that's focused on these different areas, particularly around life sciences. One area where there's probably less oversight is in the military side. And my personal view is that Xi Jinping is actually, he kind of has a fetish for really advanced, exotic, national security technologies. He talks about things like the assassin's mace and all sorts of different things. And, it's, I think the equivalent would be like Edward Teller being told yes 100 times over for everything he wanted to fund. I think that's kind of the equivalent of China today. And so then on the what that might mean for strategic deterrence and international security also likely has, ramifications that we won't understand for quite some time.
Charlie Baser.
Yeah, thanks. So I think you've touched on my question a number of times already, and just I want to use the next question, but in some ways when you compare spending and so on and so forth, it looks like it's very much a zero-sum kind of competition or something, but as you also point out, an awful lot of that spending actually in some ways will contribute to sort of international knowledge. And so have you sliced it and diced it for sort of, I know it would be hard, but how much of this is actually a security threat? Like a lot of those big projects, like looking for neutrinos, high energy physics, looking out, in the outer space, none of those have foreseeable dangers, pose any foreseeable danger. On the flip side, if you produce a huge number of really good scientists, they're going to go off and do lots of, any variety of things. But still, if you had to look at it, you could, how does it, the security dimension of this investment look to you? And how does it compare to the U.S. side? And how do you even define that? I mean, I guess, you can do it narrowly and broadly. So I'm just.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a proposal I've had, is that the U.S. should conduct and fund a sort of net assessment on a qualitative and quantitative basis. Nothing like that exists. When I toured all the national labs this year, and they haven't done anything like that. Probably should. And that maybe something MIT could work on with partnership with others. Overall, my sense, just from looking at the data and what we've been collecting in terms of research, it's a mix. But many of these things you look, and actually they do benefit military research. So, for example, space radio telescopes, China is also working to use those for space situational domain awareness. So high resolution space radio telescopes and optical telescopes. You can look at stars. You can also look at space debris, low Earth orbit satellites, track things in real time. For dark matter, I mean, there's the extreme side of like antimatter and whether or not that's going to have military applications, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Yes, no one's really done it, but there are, though, many of these that have, like in quantum detection, that's clearly driven by military application, at least within China. The high energy physics, a lot of it's driven by China's nuclear weapons program. So particularly anything related to high energy density physics, where the U.S. actually, the National Nuclear Security Administration is the predominant organization in the U.S. that funds high energy density physics for weapons science. That's basically stagnant funding. There's no new funding in that area, where China is just going significant increase in nuclear weapons science. And that's because when they add 1,000 to 1,500 new nuclear warheads, they need to simulate, design all of those different warhead designs, and all these facilities will help them do that. But they'll have a huge spillover in commercial domain as well, as nuclear weapons physicists use those facilities, but so do astrophysicists to understand the inner workings of planets and suns and stars, but also fusion energy. So I think it's all very symbiotic, and there's a lot of interrelation behind a lot of it.
So we have like 1 minute. I have one question I want to ask for wrapping up, and it sort of tees off of Charlie's. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of China's defense industries or the PLA in the shaping of basic science priorities, and sort of for this purpose, like exclude nuclear? So if we're thinking about stealth, radar, sonar, all of the kind of things you'd want to use to enhance your conventional capabilities, how does the PLA get sort of RFPs into the system, or help set priorities?
Yeah, I mean, so the PLA has their own separate science and technology and equipment development ecosystem. There is a PLA Science and Technology Commission. It's kind of operating kind of like a DARPA type of organization. There is also something known as a Central Special Committee, which never went away. It's kind of still there. They do things like decide the date of launch for new rockets and the different stealth development priorities. I think what we don't know, it's very likely now that a lot of that is merged with the new Central Science Technology Commission. The fact that the Central Science Technology Commission is secretive likely indicates it has a lot of joint dual use activity. And so it's very likely now that at the very top, the military is now sitting with the civilian side and co-developing priorities, programs, and research focus areas. Even on the civilian side, if you look at, for example, China's mega projects or their basic science programs, you see in the program management, population of military scientists and experts, and the experts committee, civilians and scientists of both military and civilian nature sitting together. And that's not unlike many projects in the United States. That might end up where the Department of Defense might be a co-funder of some things. And a lot of it, they've tried to emulate, in fact, the US system. So, overall, you see as a result of that, big investments into material science, into aerodynamics and aerospace technology, into space, into quantum. And these are areas that have, very strong spillover effect into the military. In fact, for China's National Material Science Project, which every year they release funding priorities, 8 out of the 10 are all very directly military related. Even though it's their civilian material science project, a lot of them are like, material science and engineering for extreme environments, or, extreme radiation effects material science testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes.
Well, this has been terrific, Jimmy. I want to plug your short course in San Diego.
Oh,
Can you
yes.
say a few words about that for any of the students?
Yeah. So, UCSD, we started this this year. First time. It's a 3-day course on China's science technology ecosystem. So if you want to learn everything from the history of science from 1949 to how China's organizing all these different programs, it's a 3-day course in La Jolla. And you can see the beach from the classroom. We work in some free time. And so it's usually right before a weekend as well, if you want to spend a weekend, but also learn a lot about Chinese science policy, which is the most important, obviously. So.
Well, what a terrific talk. Everyone, please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.